Good afternoon, friends. I, on behalf of Beyond Law CLC, welcome you all to another webinar wherein we have been in the series of webinars we are pursuing with the speakers who can share their insights on different issues of law and various other aspects. And the speakers are having immense knowledge and they're erudite speakers. And Mr. Sharat Chandran, advocate of Madras High Court, is a testimony of the fact that in terms of academics, he has achieved gold medals and he has also studied from Oxford with being awarded the Corpus Christi Prize. He has also been a research assistant with the Honorable the Chief Justice of India. As we all know that Constitution of India is a line which one feels is you can keep on learning. There are different facets being one keeps on seeing as to how the law is developing in this aspects of law. And that is why of late we have been taking one particular article of within the Constitution of India. And rather in the present session, we have just taken one of the facets of Article of 14 as to how it touches the touchstones of different aspects within the Article 14. And we requested Mr. Sharat to give his insights on this particular topic. And we are quite sure that all the participants who are watching us live on the Facebook and present on the platform today, and subsequently to the channel of Beyond Law CLC, when we upload this webinar, they would be definitely get a different flip to the mindset on what is Article 14. Before I request Mr. Sharat to speak, I would like to acknowledge that Professor V.K. Bansal, the former chairman of the Punjab University Law Department, is here, and I have studied from him. And we also have Dr. Shikha. She's teaching in ULS. Welcome to them, and to all those participants who are connected with us for so much time that we have done more than 150 webinars during these testing times. And these all aspects gives us different aspects and different flips to move forward and get ourselves educated at the mains, and at the same time, the participants also get educated on that aspect. Over to you, Mr. Sharat.
Thank you. Good evening, friends. Professor Bansal, Dr. Shikha, good evening to you as well. Thank you, Vikas, for giving me this opportunity to speak to all of you today on this on Article 14. As you said very rightly, the Constitution is an ocean, and it's a day-by-day learning process for all of us, including lawyers. The jurisprudence, which is in the last 70 years, is not enough for a lifetime of study. It's tremendous. So what I'm going to do today is only a facet of Article 14, more specifically what is known as the doctrine of reasonable classification. And of course, as you said, the manifest arbitrariness is going to be dealt with in another subject by another speaker. So before I go on to the aspect of classification, I would all request you to look at Article 14 to see what exactly is the philosophical content of the equality principle. Now, as most of you will be knowing, Article 14 embodies the principle, Aristotelian principle, that you must treat like things alike. So, philosophically speaking, that is easier said than done, because how do you go by picking out what is a like thing for the purposes of treating them alike? That is a big quandary. So in philosophy, it is easy to say that equality means you must treat likes alike. But what is alike is a big question. And that is the problem which has faced the application of the principle of equality to concrete cases. Over 100 years ago, Justice Field of the United States Supreme Court said, for the purposes of application of law, treating likes alike means like those persons similarly situated must be imposed with the same burdens and the same positives. He says if you're going to grant concessions and impose burdens, those burdens and concessions must be granted to all those persons similarly situated. But this again gave rise to another controversy. Now, as you know, any law will make some kind of classification. There is a law for minors, there may be a law for disabled persons, there may be a law in respect of a special category of persons conferring on some special benefits. The legislator therefore must be given the right to classify. But if you classify, then there is some degree of inequality because some class gets left out. So what is known as very famously known as the equality paradox. The equality paradox is laws classify, and the very idea of classification produces inequality. Now, how do you reconcile this? So then the courts developed what is known as the test of reasonable classification. This was done in the United States in a very early case called Southern Railway Company versus Green, which was a 1910 decision. The principle was set out by Justice Day, where he said that a reasonable classification is permitted without doing violence to the equal protection of the laws. Such classification must be based upon some real and substantial distinction, and also bear a real and substantial distinction to the classification that is imposed. And an arbitrary classification will not pass the test of equality. And he gave a very interesting example. He said, if you're going to make a law for minors, it is saved. But if you make a law for minors who are red-haired, then it will be a piece of legislative despotism. So a classification must be based on an intelligible differentia. And that intelligible differentia must have a rational nexus with the object of the act. This was the American Supreme Court's interpretation of its 14th Amendment in the United States Constitution, which embodies what is known as the equal protection principle. In India, before the Constitution, there was no general equality principle, but if you see the Section 298 of the Government of India Act, it's a very interesting provision. That contains a very interesting provision which says that a person will not be discriminated on the basis of religion, descent, place of birth, etc., in matters of public employment or in matters of profession, trade, calling, etc. A very limited but very interesting. It is actually one of the first provisions, anti-discrimination provisions in the British statute, Section 298 of the Government of India Act of 1935. But when the framers were putting together Article 14 in the present form, there was a very interesting debate between, on the one hand, you had Sir B.N. Rao, Benigal Rao, the constitutional advisor to the Constituent Assembly. And on the other hand, you had a very interesting debate with Sir Alladi Krishnasamy Iyer and Mr. K.M. Munshi. Mr. B.N. Rao said that the expression equality before the law is taken from the Weimar Constitution, Section 109 of Germany. But there is a common misconception that equality before the law, the first expression, if you look at Article 14, it contains two expressions. It says equality before the law and equal protection of the laws. Equality before the law, it is thought is taken from Section 40 of the Irish Constitution. And it is not. If you read Sir B.N. Rao's book, he says it is borrowed from Article 109 of the Weimar Constitution of Germany, which in turn is based upon the famous work of Professor Albert Wynne Dicey from Oxford in his work Law of the Constitution. Now, Dicey, most of you would have been aware in administrative law, we studied that Dicey's rule of law theory. Now, that says, what is the rule of law? It has three distinct meanings. Our first two meanings are important for our present purposes. The first meaning is that it is the absolute supremacy of the law. The law is above everyone else. And secondly, all persons are subject to the law and to the ordinary law courts. No person is exempt from the operation of the law and the processes of the law and prosecution before the ordinary law courts. You don't have special law courts for special persons. So you have the very famous expression, the law is no respecter of persons. That is probably the short way of saying what is Dicey's principle of rule of law. And this is the first expression, equal protection of the law. Then you have the expression, equality before the law, that's first expression. The second expression is equal protection of the laws. That expression is taken from the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution. So what we have is a very interesting mix of the UK-based Dicey model of equality before the law and the American model of equal protection of the laws spliced together in one article. Now there is a big debate in the Constituent Assembly because Alladi Krishnasamy Iyer, the very famous constitutional expert who was a member of the Constituent Assembly, said, you drop this expression equality before the law, we will have only the American concept. Professor Munshi, who was another respected member of the Constituent Assembly, said, you will drop equal protection of the laws, you will have only Dicey. Then the drafting committee came away with a compromise formula and said, we will retain both expressions. So thus was born Article 14 in the present form, containing both the UK model of Dicey's rule of law, which is the first part, and the second part following from the American Constitution of the 14th Amendment. And you can see, if you look at this is borne out by the Chief Justice Rajamannar's opinion in B.G. Rao's case, the very famous case concerning Article 19, as most of you would know. The Madras judgment in the full bench also supports this interpretation. Now so this came together in the Constitution of India 1950. Immediately after the Constitution, the first major case was Chiranjit Lal Chowdhury's case. Now, most of you would know it's a very famous decision. The first case involving an Article 14 challenge. So immediately the question was, what was the test that the court was going to apply while invoking Article 14? The challenge was twofold. Mr. Chiranjit Lal was a man who held one share in the Sholapur spinning and weaving mills in Bombay. The government had nationalized the company and of course imposed certain disabilities on the shareholders. They could not move for any winding up petitions without the express consent of the government, etc. Post of burdens, but this company was singled out. It was the only company on which the action was taken. So a petition was filed in the Supreme Court by the shareholders saying, look, this company has been singled out for this particular action. It violates Article 19(1)(f), which was then right to property, and Article 14. Article 14 challenge was obviously on the ground. This company has been targeted. It is a one-man classification. This legislation operates only as against this company, and therefore it is a hostile discrimination. The Supreme Court was split. There was a 5-2 verdict. Patanjali Shastri and S.R. Das dissenting. But in this particular case, a very important principle was laid down. Justice Mukherjee, who was one of the B.K. Mukherjee, who wrote one of the opinions for the majority, expressly referred to Justice Day's opinion in the Southern Railway Company case of 1910 and imported the classification doctrine test from the United States and applied it to India. And this was the case where if you see where they say the origins of the reasonable classification doctrine as borrowed from the American Constitution is brought in to Indian constitutional law through Chiranjit Lal through the opinions of all the judges. If you see all the judges, including the dissenting judges, they refer copiously to the American Constitution and they take the test of reasonable classification from there. Now, most interestingly, I also found, and I think I should bring this to your notice, in the dissenting opinion of Justice S.R. Das, it contains a very interesting reference to how he resolves the equality paradox. Justice Das said, I am aware of the fact that discrimination produces inequality, but mere production of inequality is not sufficient. The law must go more. The inequality which is produced must be hostile and palpably unreasonable. It is not mere inequality that is sufficient. The inequality produced by way of discrimination must be palpably arbitrary and unreasonable. So this was the threshold that the law was required to meet, because he was aware. I mean, theoretical difficulties was that classification produces inequality. So how do you reconcile inequality with the principle under Article 14? You reconcile it by saying
Yeah, unmute yourself, Sharath. I'm trying. Yes.
okay, now it's fine. Sorry, this got cut off. So Justice Das therefore said in his dissenting judgment that the answer to the equality paradox is not merely showing that inequality was caused. You must reach the threshold of saying it is manifestly and palpably unreasonable. This was the very important test in Charanjit Lal Chaudhary. They, of course, upheld the act. The dissenting judges, Justice S.R. Das and Justice Patanjali Shastri, struck it down. But the most important and the most influential decision today, insofar as Article 14 is concerned, was the decision of the Supreme Court in State of West Bengal versus Anwar Ali Sarkar, which was an appeal from Calcutta. Now, the West Bengal government, soon after partition, as you know, there were riots and several disturbances. So they promulgated, and just before independence, they promulgated an ordinance setting up special courts for trial. Now, the object of the act was special courts for speedier trial. There were no classes of offences. Anything the government could say could be sent to the special court. The Calcutta High Court struck it down as violator of Article 14. The matter came to the Supreme Court. Before the Supreme Court, the petitioners succeeded. Now, I would just bear in mind there are one accompanying decision. Anwar Ali Sarkar must be read in conjunction with another very important case called Kati Raning Rawat, which was, the distinction is, State of West Bengal was Anwar Ali Sarkar was delivered on 11th of January 1952. Kati Raning Rawat's case was delivered on 27th February 1952. If you must read both the cases to understand the principle in full operation. Because the Supreme Court, while striking down the West Bengal Act, upheld the Saurashtra Act. The distinction was on account of the fact that the Saurashtra Act said speedier trial for offences involving public tranquility, maintenance of law and order, etc. There was a class of offences for which the Act prescribed a faster procedure. For example, no committal proceedings, the jury was dispensed with, etc., etc. There were a lot of things for faster procedure. But those faster procedure was in respect of a classes of offences. Therefore, the Supreme Court said, insofar as these classes of offences are concerned, there is a rational nexus with the object of the Act, which is speedier trial of offences. In the West Bengal Act, it simply says speedier trial of offences. The government was given a free hand, whatever it is, whether it is a petty offence or a grave offence of murder, you can send it for a special court. So, if you look at the opinion of Justice Fazal Ali in Kati Raning Rawat, he draws the distinction between the two cases. He says the West Bengal case is discrimination without reason, and the Saurashtra case is discrimination with reason. And he says that is the distinguishing factor which saves the Saurashtra Act and invalidates the West Bengal Act. So the West Bengal law simply said speedier trial. They said we don't know what is a speedier trial for. If speedier trial may be an object, but what is the basis of classification? It cannot be the same. Therefore, the law was invalidated. Now, by the time the law developed, it came to by 1958, by the time Ramakrishna Dalmia's case was formulated, several principles were already in place by the Supreme Court. The law was more or less settled about what Article 14 really was. The crucial point that we noted is Article 14 was a guarantee against discrimination. So therefore, the requirement of discrimination was inherent in what was inhibited by Article 14 was discrimination. And I just want to just put up this table. Can you just enable that for me, Vikas? I just wanted to just put up this table. Right. Can all of you see this this table? Yeah, can you see the table now? So
just make the size slightly broader so that it's more visible.
Right. Is it okay now?
Yeah, it's fine.
So look at now these are the 6 principles which, now if you see all these 6 principles are culled out from American decisions. So Justice Das in Tendulkar's case lays down these propositions as the working principles for application of Article 14. Now if you look at each of these principles, all these principles are taken from American cases. Please look at the first one, that a law may be constitutional even though it relates to a single individual if on account of special circumstances or reasons applicable to him and not applicable to others, that single individual may be treated as a class by himself. This was the Chiranjit Lal category. Where is it borrowed from? It is borrowed from the observations of Professor Hugh Evander Willis. There is a very famous professor in Willis on constitutional law. And it was cited by Justice Mukherjee even in Chiranjit Lal. Second principle, there is a presumption in favor of constitutionality of an enactment, and the burden is upon him who attacks to show that there has been a transgression of the constitutional principles. Classical burden test, borrowed from Stewart versus Lindsay in the United States. Third principle, the legislature is presumed to be to understand and correctly appreciate the need of its own people, and the laws are directed to problems that made manifest by experience, and that its discriminations are based on adequate grounds. Corresponding U.S. case law, Justice Pitney in Middleton versus Texas Power. Then, the legislature is free to recognize degrees of harm and may confine its restrictions to those cases where the need is deemed to be the clearest. The corresponding observations, Chief Justice Hughes in West Coast Hotel versus Parish.
Sharon, you can just do stop annotation so that nobody scribbles on that.
I see.
Because someone is doing scribbling, though I would request a participant not to do that.
I see. I'm not able to see how I'm going to do
on
that.
the bottom, you will find that there is stop annotation. Just do that.
I see. Okay. All right. It's okay. I'm almost done.
Yeah, it's fine.
Almost reaching the end. Just 2 more principles. The next principle, that in order to sustain the presumption of constitutionality, the court may take into consideration matters of common knowledge, matters of common report, history of times, and may assume that every state of facts which can be conceived existing at the time of legislation. Corresponding principle, Justice Van Deventer in Stewart versus Lindsay. The last principle, while good faith and knowledge of existing conditions on the part of the legislature are to be presumed, if there is nothing on the face of the law or the surrounding circumstances brought to the notice of the court on which the classification may be regarded as based, the presumption of constitutionality cannot be carried to the extent of always holding that there must be some undisclosed and unknown reasons for subjecting certain individuals or corporations to hostile or discriminating legislation. This, once again, is taken from the observations of Justice Brewer in Gulf and Colorado and Santa Fe Company. So, if you the long and short of the matter is, all of the 6 principles formulated by Chief Justice Das in the Tendulkar case were borrowed from decisions in American law, tested decisions in American law, which is why I said the obvious choice for the Supreme Court was to lean in favor of American decisions and take principles from there, having in mind the fact that the American cases were the ones which influenced the framers to put this expression, equal protection of the laws, in Article 14. Now to just come back to Justice Das. Another facet or another thing which I wanted to just discuss was in regards to Article 14 is the degree of scrutiny. Now, in the United States, if a classification is based on race, suppose a law which says that, the usual things, the landmark judgments have all developed on race-based relations there. Suppose a law which said that Negroes were given affirmative action, a law which challenged affirmative action programs for Negroes was always subject to what is known as the strict scrutiny standard. Now, the strict scrutiny standard is the highest degree of testing a legislation in the United States. This is, the court will require compelling reasons for the government to justify why it has discriminated and made a legislation based on something such as race. In India, it has been extended to sex also, but in the United States, race-based classification are deemed suspect and therefore will be tested by what is known as the strict scrutiny standard, which is the highest level of scrutiny. The strict scrutiny standard will require the government to show that it had a compelling government interest to use that particular classification, and that particular classification was the only means of achieving the object desired. So a very, very tough test. The burden of proof was extremely high. In India, and a very interesting case, I don't know if some of you would be aware of it, a case of Anuj Garg. It was a 2008 decision of Justice S.B. Sinha and Justice Bedi. It challenged the constitutional validity of Section 30 of the Punjab Excise Act of 1914. That act said that men below the age of 25 years and women cannot be permitted to work in areas which serve liquor. Now, the Supreme Court, of course, and so there was one category which said that, okay, insofar as it is men below 25 and women, men and women are put in the same category, therefore there cannot be any discrimination. The Supreme Court said no. Insofar as men were concerned, it was a denial of the right to be considered for employment. So Justice Sinha says, look, we have lots of persons who are passing out from hotel management courses at the age of 22 and 23. They will have no jobs if this particular law is kept in force. Therefore, there is a denial of right of equality of opportunity. But the most important part is, insofar as women were concerned, Justice Sinha, for the first time, applied the strict scrutiny standard for a sex-based classification, and he said a law which was valid in the morals of the 19th century or the 20th century, 1914 was the act, need not necessarily pass muster insofar as the standards of the 21st century are concerned. Very, very important point. Secondly, he said, by imposing this disability of not allowing women to work in this particular places where liquor was served, instead of enhancing their security and making these workplaces safe, you are banning them outrightly. So it is known, this is a law which perpetuates what is known as romantic paternalism. Justice Sinha was a very landmark judgment, Anuj Garg versus the state in 2008, and it was this decision which held that a classification based on sex will be judged by what is known as the strict scrutiny standard. There are, of course, two other tests, what is known as intermediate scrutiny and rational things. Why I'm emphasizing this is, the requirement is when there is a classification, and the classification must have a rational nexus with the object of the act. Now, in testing classification with the object, the court will apply one of these three tests, which is strict scrutiny, intermediate scrutiny, and rational scrutiny. These are the three tests in the US. Strict scrutiny has been abandoned in India by and large after Ashok Kumar Thakur's case. But the only instance where I found it was applied was in the case of Anuj Garg. Right, so this is on the basis of classification. One another facet which you should really take note of is a very interesting case which happened in 1956, where Justice Vivian Bose said that it is not merely classification alone. Suppose the object of the act itself is condemnable, then also the Article 14 is violated. To illustrate this example, you must see his Justice Vivian Bose's opinion in Anwar Ali Sarkar, a fantastic dissent. Justice Bose says, think of a law which provides for speedier trial of offences for persons on the basis of their skull size. Persons having bigger skulls are presumed to be intelligent. Therefore, normal trial for them. Persons having smaller skull sizes are presumed to be less intelligent. Therefore, expedited procedures for them. He says, can such a law pass muster? It is by way of textbook standard. It meets all the requirements, but the object itself is condemnable, and such law can never pass muster. So you should kindly look at the example given by Justice Vivian Bose with the skull in Anwar Ali Sarkar, and his observations in the BD supply case in 1956. That is where he says, it is not merely classification, but if the object of the act itself is prohibited, then also Article 14 is infringed. This particular principle was affirmed by the Supreme Court in 2014 in the very famous case of Subramanian Swamy versus Union of India, where as most of you know, Section 6 capital A of the Delhi Special Police Act of 1946 the constitutional validity was challenged. Section 6 capital A was a provision which said that the CBI cannot inquire or investigate into the allegations of corruption by persons who are holding a rank higher than Joint Secretary without this express permission of the central government. So Dr. Swamy challenged it, and the Supreme Court said 6A is invalid because its very object is condemnable, because the object itself was having the propensity to shield the corrupt. That is what Chief Justice Lodha said. So since the object itself was having the tendency to protect corrupt persons, the object itself was invalid and is objectionable, and therefore Article 14 was violated. So the emphasis is therefore, Article 14 need not be necessarily violated only on classification. Even if the object is bad, then also Article 14 will stand infringed by, if you look at the latest decision of the Constitution Bench in Subramanian Swamy versus Union of India in 2014. So 6A was not invalidated on classification. Applying Justice Bose in 1956, even if the object was bad, the act would go. Another facet of Article 14's application is the effect of the law. Now, this is a very, very far-reaching decision delivered by one of our very famous judges, Justice Subba Rao, later Chief Justice Subba Rao, in a decision called Khandige Sham Bhatt in 1963. In that case, Justice Subba Rao said that it is not merely the classification of the object, but it is the effect of the law also, which may result in violation of Article 14. Now, normally, discrimination is of two types. Direct discrimination, which is basically discrimination based on the ground on a prohibited ground, like for example, sex or race of birth, religion, etc. Article 15, you see all those grounds there. Indirect discrimination is where the law is facially neutral, but the operation of the law is such that it results in unequal operation and it affects one particular category of persons. So I'll give you an example of a very famous case in the European Union, where a pension scheme was not available to part-time workers. A lady called Bilka, B-I-L-K-A, went to the European Court of Human Rights saying that, look, I am a working woman and all working women will only be part-time workers because, look, part-time workers cannot, we have to care for our households. We have responsibilities, and therefore, as working mothers, it will only be possible for us to work part-time. So if this particular scheme of pensions only for full-time workers is implemented, it will mean that a large category of persons who are women will be affected. Although the rule said all persons who are part-time workers are not entitled, but the operation of that particular rule will affect a large number of women more than men. The European Court of Human Rights agreed with her, and this is what is known as indirect discrimination, which is basically practices which are fair in form but discriminatory in operation. Right? Fair in form, that is to say textually, and it's facially neutral, but the operation of such a provision produces unequal results. This is what Justice Subbarao said in 1963. Mind you, the US got its civil rights statute in 1964, and the first landmark decision on indirect discrimination was in 1971. The decision in Griggs versus the Duke Power Company, and it's to our credit that 7 years before all this, in 1963, Chief Justice Subbarao had the vision to say that a legislation can also be invalidated if it produces unequal results, and its operation it operates differently on different people. And as I gave you the example of Bilka, it's a classic case where you would know the easiest argument is, look, the qualification for pension is same. If you are a full-time worker, you get it. If you're not a full-time worker, you don't get it. It applies to both men and women. But the fact remains that Bilka was able to show that the operation of such a provision will affect only women more than men, because women form the 70 to 60 to 70% of the part-time working force. So, although it was facially neutral, it produced inequality by virtue of its effect on the different classes of persons. So this is also another form of what is known as indirect discrimination. If you look at Justice Chandrachud's opinion, concurring opinion in the Navtej Singh Johar, which is the Section 377 case, you will find that he has specifically referred to Bilka. He has also specifically referred to indirect discrimination in the context of how it affects persons homosexuals under 377. I would request you to kindly look at the opinion of concurring opinion of Justice Chandrachud to just look at the point. So just to just sum up this particular section: classification, object of the act, effect of the act. On all three grounds, you have decisions which says that Article 14 will help to invalidate a law which falls foul of the equal protection guarantee. Now, sometime in 1974, they developed something known as the arbitrariness doctrine. This was developed primarily by Justice Bhagwati in the celebrated decision of E.P. Royappa. Now, who was E.P. Royappa? He was a civil servant from Tamil Nadu, and he challenged his transfer order on the ground of malafide. Chief Justice Ray, who wrote one of the opinions, dismissed the petition saying no malafide need. Justice Bhagwati, dismissing the petition, there's no relief, went on to give a long lecture on what is known as arbitrariness and what is this thing. That caught on, and in Menaka Gandhi, it became what is known today as the arbitrariness principle. Now, this arbitrariness principle has come in for some very heavy criticism from constitutional scholars like Sirvai. Extremely heavy criticism. He says that it is a freestanding principle having no substantive content. Many conservatives like me will be inclined to agree. But for the present time, my argument is going to be confined only to arbitrariness and legislation alone. Let me tell you, friends, the decision in Royappa did not concern legislation. Please remember, it was a challenge to an administrative order of transfer. Right? Ajay Hasia, the second case which is quoted in favor of the principle of arbitrariness, also was not a case relating to legislation. Menaka Gandhi, although there was a challenge to legislation, please remember Menaka Gandhi's case was decided on a concession by the Attorney General of India. The Attorney General of India conceded, saying we will reconsider her application. But 7 judges delivered a judgment running into 155 pages. And ultimately, the relief was on the basis of the concession given by the Attorney General. Justice Bhagwati is now advocated as the forerunner for the arbitrariness doctrine. But let me tell you, there is not a single decision before 1986 when Justice Bhagwati retired, where arbitrariness was applied to legislation. Article 14 was always understood in the sense of discrimination. However, insofar as administrative action was concerned, a new doctrine of arbitrariness was developed. But that is a separate chapter, and so far as administrative action is concerned, you can talk about it. It is a separate chapter by itself. But for the purposes of Article 14 QA legislation, the question is whether a second doctrine exists aside from discrimination. I've already told you this, the cornerstone of Article 14 is discrimination. The question is whether, aside from discrimination, there exists something known as arbitrariness. Now, this is what was an important aspect, which was argued by Justice Nariman, then a senior counsel before Justice Reddy, in the McDowell case. And in McDowell, in 1996, the Supreme Court said a law can be struck down on the way for two grounds and two grounds only. Number one, lack of legislative competence. Number two, violation of Part 3. These are the only two grounds on which it can be struck down. Of course, some people have disagreed with saying that no, there are other grounds on which you can strike down, like Article 265, etc., etc. Let's not get into that. All I'm saying is, the argument is whether there existed a separate ground of arbitrariness for the purposes of Article 15. This issue, if you see the very famous article of Professor P.K. Tripathi in 1990, AR 1990 journal, page 3, he has given a fantastic article. Professor Tripathi has written a fantastic article called on A.K. Gopalan's case. He makes a very interesting point. He says, look, Article 19 is unreasonableness. What has Menaka Gandhi done? It has equated unreasonableness with arbitrariness. Now you are saying all decisions which are unreasonable are also arbitrary. But Professor Tripathi says that need not necessarily be the case. A law may not be arbitrary, but it may still be unreasonable in the sense of Article 19. Now, it is of great interest to me that Professor P.K. Tripathi's wisdom and hindsight in 1990 was applied by Justice Nariman in 2015 decision of Shreya Singh's case. Now, Shreya Singh's case, most of you know, was a challenge to Section 66 capital A of the Information Technology Act. There were two limbs of argument. Number one, that the law violated Article 19(1)A as it imposed a chilling effect on free speech. The second argument was that it violated Article 14 as it had no nexus with the object of the Act. Now, friends, please look at this particular slide for the observation which I want you to see in the Shreya Singhal case. And I want you to see what exactly is the distinction between discrimination and, I think I'm once again disabled, Vikas. I think you'll have to enable me again. Right. Please see these observations. In para 102 of the decision in Shreya Singhal, we have already held that 66 capital A creates an offence which is vague and overbroad and therefore unconstitutional under Article 19(1)A and is not saved by Article 19(2). We have held that the wider range of circulation over the internet cannot restrict the content under 19(1)A, nor can it justify its denial. However, we come to discrimination under Article 14. We are unable to agree with the counsel for the petitioners that there is no intelligible differential between the medium of print broadcast and real life speech as opposed to speech on the internet. The intelligible differential is clear. The internet gives any individual a platform which requires very little or no payment through which to air his views. The learned Additional Solicitor General has correctly said that something posted on a site or website travels like lightning and can reach millions of persons all over the world. If the petitioners were right, this Article 14 argument would apply equally to all other offences created under the Information Technology Act, which are not the subject matter of challenge in these petitions. We make it clear there is an intelligible differential between speech on the internet and other mediums of communication for which separate offences can certainly be created by legislation. We therefore find the challenge on the ground of Article 14 must fail. Now, why is this an important decision? Because perceptibly, Justice Nariman has rightly found that there is a distinction between unreasonableness under Article 19 and discrimination under Article 14. But the problem with the proponents of this arbitrariness doctrine of Justice Bhagwati from Maneka Gandhi is the fact that they say that unreasonableness under Article 19 is also subsumed in Article 14. Now, very unfortunately, in the Shaira Bano judgment, as most of you would know, that is a judgment which has now given birth to what is known as the doctrine of manifest arbitrariness as a separate head of challenge under Article 14. Now, what is this case about? This is a very simple case, which I just touch upon it briefly because anyway, it has to complete the picture necessarily. I have to say this. Shaira Bano was a case which involved the challenge to the triple talaq. Three of the judges, Justice Kehar, with whom Justice Kehar and Justice, if I remember correctly, it is Nazir, said that, look, we are not going to go into the issue of whether personal laws are covered under the Sharia Act. So they left it aside. Kurian Joseph J. agreed with that. Justice Nariman and Justice Lalit gave a separate decision which said, if talaq is brought into practice through Section 3 of the Sharia Act of 1937. Therefore, so we will test Section 3 with Article 14. So far, so good. In the course of the decision, Justice Nariman declared McDowell to be per incuriam and held that insofar as Article 14 is concerned, there was a discrimination aspect, that is the first part, and what is known as the arbitrariness aspect, which is the second part. So for the first time in 2016, you have, after 66 years, you had a new decision throwing upon a different aspect to Article 14. But this is a very problematic doctrine because I'll tell you why. The decisions subsequent to Shaira Bano have showed us that the words discrimination and arbitrariness have been interchangeably and loosely used. In Shaira Bano, you say discrimination is distinct from arbitrariness. By Nikesh Tarachand Shah's case in 2018, discrimination and arbitrariness are now used interchangeably. I'll show you the exact portions of judgment. Just two examples I will take. The first example is the opinion of Justice Indu Malhotra, concurring opinion of Justice Indu Malhotra in the 377 challenge. And the second judgment is the Nikesh Tarachand Shah case, which was basically a challenge to Section 45 of the Prevention of Money Laundering Act of, as you know, they have struck down the onerous bail provisions, applying manifest arbitrariness. But the reason why I'm projecting this before you is to emphasize and say that even though the Supreme Court in Shaira Bano has recognized arbitrariness as a separate head of challenge, its application has unfortunately resulted in complete confusion. And you will see this in this two particular slides. Let me just show you this in. Yes. Can you see this observation of Justice Malhotra and on the screen? Because
yeah.
Right. So in Naftech, please see Justice Malhotra rightly says that it violates Article 14 under the classification test. There's no doubt about it. It does. But look at these observations. Section 377, insofar as it criminalizes consensual sexual acts between adults in private, is not based on any sound or rational principle, since the basis of criminalization is sexual orientation of the person, over which one has little or no choice. So obviously this is a reference to the classification doctrine, because the classification is not based on any rational criteria. Sexual orientation is not a valid criteria. No problem. The next sentence please see. The phrase carnal intercourse against the order of nature in section 377 as a determining principle in a penal provision is too open-ended, giving way to scope of misuse against the members of the LGBT community. Now, with all due respect, the fear of abuse of a law is no ground to strike down a legislation. So, if you look at Justice Malhotra's opinion very carefully, the learned judge very rightly says, yes, it does not meet the requirements of valid classification. Yet, she goes one step further and says, the law is invalid on the ground of violation of the classification doctrine. It also violates the manifest arbitrariness doctrine because it is capable of abuse. Now, with all due respect, once you have already held it to be a violator of the principle of the classification doctrine, I don't see any reason why you should apply manifest arbitrariness. All right, even if you might apply manifest arbitrariness, what is the logic of saying that law is manifestly arbitrary because it is capable of being abused? As I have said, in Radheshyam Kale's case in 1950, Supreme Court has very clearly said an abuse of law cannot be a ground to strike down a legislation. So, substantively, the content of a manifest arbitrariness appears to be lacking. And the clearest example of this is found in Nikesh Tarachand Shah's case, which is a decision, as I said, challenging Section 45 of the Prevention of Money Laundering Act. Now, please see this observation. On the one hand, it is clear that the term of imprisonment for more than 3 years for a scheduled or predicate offence would be manifestly arbitrary and unjust classification. So, manifest arbitrariness is applied to classification. Whereas in Shaira Bano, the learned judges have held that classification and arbitrariness are two different things. This observation is nothing new. If you go back to Justice S.R. Das's opinion in Chiranjit Lal, he also said, a classification cannot be arbitrary. You cannot be having whims and fancies of persons. But you cannot apply manifest arbitrariness to classification and say it is a new doctrine. That cannot be done. In Nikesh Tarachand Shah's case, please, if you look at the judgment, I have only taken one. You can see several instances. I don't want to take all your time on that. Several places, the word manifest arbitrariness has been used in conjunction with discrimination. That means the distinction you have drawn in Shaira Bano has collapsed. You conceived it as two different categories. Now you have collapsed those two categories and you are using discrimination and arbitrariness interchangeably. What then is the rationale? That is the question now which one hopes in future the Supreme Court will have to clarify, because already in academic circles, I'm sure many of you would be aware, murmurs have started against this manifest arbitrariness doctrine, because the basis on which it rests is, in my opinion, completely shaky. The other problem is, if you look at it very, very carefully, friends, the largest quorum on the point on Article 14 is a decision of Chief Justice Chandrachud in the Special Courts Bill of 1978. That is a 7-judge decision. In the 7-judge decision, he has authoritatively said that the test for Article 14 is classification, and he has laid down 13 principles which form the test for classification. This judgment has not even been noticed in Shaira Bano. The Shaira Bano takes into account several other decisions in 5-judge bench decisions. It may be of no consequence. The authoritative pronouncement of a president of Special Courts Bill Act case of 1978, it may be it gives scope for argument that at some point of time, this particular doctrine may require a relook to somehow give it a substantive content. But in my opinion, it does not give any extra leverage and look, it's constitutional law. So we must necessarily not be cloistered. We must be willing to accept a new idea provided it gives us something new. If it is going to be an old wine in a new bottle, then I don't think we require doctrine at all. So on the one hand, while we require an improved test, the test must bring something new to the table. There's no point in having something which does not do so. So I think I've taken up my time sufficiently, and these particular aspects are this, and I'd be happy to take questions if there are any.
Yeah. Thank you, Sharath. You quite elaboratively explained in a short span the entire gamut of this thing. Now, only one question so far has come. What is the how reasonable classification is interpreted? Is there any parameter to determine it?
So, as I said, reasonable classifications interpreted. If you look at the decision in Chiranjit Lal Chaudhary, it says you can classify on an intelligible differential, basically saying that look, the state must apply its mind and say we have taken these categories of persons for this particular reason, and the act which has been enacted is for this object. So this classification has some rationale with this object. So it's a working test. That's all I can say. And if you look, if it's of interest to note that in the United States, classifications on the basis of race and sex are suspect classifications. Straight away, the state must start from a disadvantage. Similar things have been if you look at Article 15, there are certain enumerated categories again, like the place of birth, descent, sex, etc., which are now looked as suspect categories. So those kind of categories, the state will have to there's more compelling burden on the state to justify why it has used that particular basis or classification.
Since the question has not come, you could just explain how Shreya Singhal came into being and how Section 66A was.
No, Shreya Singhal, as you know, see, it was a decision which was a challenge to Section 66 capital A of the Information Technology Act. The main ground of challenge was on the ground that 66A imposed an unreasonable restriction on free speech, because 66A was a very draconian provision. And if you look at the judgment of Justice R.F. Nariman and Justice Chalameshwar, they very rightly say, applying the test in Ramesh Thappar's case, that this standard for a reasonable restriction in Article 19(1)(a) is extremely high. So they in fact say they equate it to the freedom of speech provisions in the US Constitution. And it's a landmark decision because the limits of free speech were set so high that the state was required to show an extremely high burden to support a provision which infringed free speech. So it is a decision which is useful in the sense of Article 19 and understanding how a reasonable restriction can be imposed on free speech under Article 19. Why I relied upon Shreya Singhal is that it was also an Article 14 challenge. But in that Article 14 challenge, Justice Nariman very rightly said that it is unreasonable in the sense of Article 19, but it is not discriminatory in the sense of Article 14. Therefore, the principle that one must keep in mind is what is unreasonable under 19 need not necessarily be discriminatory under 14. If one keeps this basic principle in mind, they're easy to see that the claim made by judgments like Menaka Gandhi is certainly flawed, because what it says is an action which is unreasonable, a legislative action which is unreasonable is also arbitrary. Legislative and arbitrariness is equal to unreasonableness. This is not correct. And that is why I said, please read the article of Professor P.K. Tripathi in AR 1990 Journal, page 3. It is a fantastic article, and I'm sure all of you would benefit from reading it. The foresight that man had to see, that Professor Tripathi had to see 25 years later, his very observations would be seen in Shreya Singhal's case.
And then how do you explain in terms of this Nas judgment?
No, Nas is manifest up. There's no doubt about it. In the 377 review, they had used both manifest arbitrariness as well as reasonable classification. If you look at all the judges, they have held that sexual orientation was not a valid. I just showed you Justice Indu Malhotra's opinion. She has very categorically said sexual orientation was not a valid classification. So all the judges, the Chief Justice Deepak Mishra, Justice Kanvilkar, all of them used this line of reasoning. All of them also, I think Justice Chandrachud did not use manifest arbitrariness, but all the other judges have used manifest arbitrariness also. So the law was held to be bad on the basis of classification, also on the ground of manifest arbitrariness. So that's why I said you don't require a sledgehammer to kill a fly. If the law is invalid for under classification, why do you require manifest arbitrariness?
You're saying this, I'm reminded when the Chief Secretary of Punjab had been under suspension and then he had been charge sheeted. The judge wrote down that only, that the state has used their entire machinery like a hammer to kill the fly.
Kill a fly.
This is by Angad Kamath. Sir, because there are no questions. How have the courts explained and dealt with the concept of intelligible differentia, and how does one go about applying it to legislation in Article 14 challenge?
I think I just answered that, Vikas. I've answered that just about the first question you had said.
Yeah.
I think there's one question here which is some thought on arbitrariness analysis under Article 14 with reference to
special reference to review on primary legislation. Yes, this question is good.
Oh, that's right. So the problem with primary legislation challenges, as I said.
First, just explain primary legislation, because some people may not be very.
So primary legislation is a statute of parliament or the state legislature. Primary law. Secondary subordinate legislation is a legislation framed pursuant to power given by parliament in an act, saying that power to frame rules. So you have rule-making power which is given to the government, and the government frames those rules and it is placed before the legislature for approval. So this is the distinction between primary legislation and secondary legislation. Insofar as secondary legislation is concerned, there's no question manifest arbitrariness doctrine can be applied. The reason for doing that is the court strikes down a rule, subordinate legislation for under manifest arbitrariness on the ground that the rule is so arbitrary that such a power cannot be deemed to have been given to that authority by parliament. The problem of applying the same logic is you cannot apply the same logic to parliament itself. You cannot say parliament is not authorized, the action is so arbitrary that parliament cannot give itself that power. That cannot be the reason. Manifest arbitrariness in the context of subordinate legislation is you're telling the government, you have made this rule under this act. And this rule is so arbitrary that the legislature cannot be deemed to have given this power to you. But you cannot apply that logic to parliament itself. That's the first problem. The second problem is you cannot have a principle saying it is of arbitrary. Second, and the biggest problem is you must kindly see. Shaira Bano was a case which declared McDowell to be per incuriam. McDowell was by a bench of 3 judges. Shaira Bano, majority was also 3. Majority on this point. Justice Kurian concurred with the others. But neither Shaira Bano nor Navtej Singh Johar, the other judgment, which is Navtej Singh Johar 377, which is 5 judges, have taken note of the larger bench decision of Chief Justice Chandrachud in the Special Courts Bill, which is 7 judges. So there exists a big problem insofar as precedents are concerned. The third and the most important aspect is Nikesh Tarachand Shah has shown to us conclusively that arbitrariness as a standalone principle is problematic. You know why? Because arbitrariness is applied in the context of discrimination. An act is said to be violative of Article 14 if it discriminates in such a manner that it is manifestly arbitrary. So manifest arbitrariness is only a label. And if you apply that logic to Article 14 by way of a freestanding principle, dehorse of discrimination, it gives dangerous power to the judges. And because if Article 14 is divorced from discrimination, then the judges can say tomorrow the Act of Parliament is invalid because we feel it is manifestly arbitrary. The check is that they must justify that it discriminates. If you take discrimination away from arbitrariness, what does it have? That is the problem that is the question that the scholars have repeatedly raised, and I hope someday the Supreme Court really gives us an answer.
What, according to you, would be the test that wherein we large number of times there is a challenge to the fact that the rules are actually in derogation of the main statute? Could you just elaborate on that?
Excessive delegation. So, if you look at the Delhi Laws Act case of a very famous decision, 7-judge decision, that decision lays down the principle of what is known as excessive delegation. That is, rule-making power is given to the authority without any control. Uncanalized power is given to the rule-making authority. So, Delhi Laws Act, you may kindly see the judgment of Supreme Court, 1952 judgment of Supreme Court, very clear on the point. It says a simple ultra-virus test, whether the rule-making power gives the authority the power to make this particular rule, number one. It can also be struck down on the ground of excessive delegation, because please understand, Parliament cannot delegate its power to make law to the executive. You are only giving rule-making power to implement the act. You cannot give your power to enact a substantive law to the government. The government cannot become a parallel legislature. That's the principle in the Delhi Laws Act.
Since there are young lawyers also, they would like, and students also, they would like to understand what is the subtle difference between the rules and the act once it is framed, and because this question invariably comes that as to how this rules have been framed and whether the rules of excessive legislation, since there are not many questions coming, but I know that these are the questions which keep on bothering the minds of a lawyer. There's a test as to how this act has to be said it is ultra vires, because what we write in the petition is that it violates Article 14, 16, but without elaborating of intelligible differentia and reasonable objective to be achieved. So what is the favor?
So no, because I think the question is in two parts. Why do you say it is ultra vires? Is it, see, if a rule-making power does not really flow from the main act, then you apply the ultra vires principle and say that, look, this rule see, the only thing is subordinate legislation does not enjoy the immunity which a primary legislation enjoys. An act of parliament or a state legislature is deemed to be constitutionally, there's a presumption of constitutionality. A subordinate legislation framed by the government does not enjoy that immunity. Of course, there is one judgment of Justice S.B. Sinha to the contrary, but I think that's not right. The accepted rule is that a subordinate legislation does not enjoy a presumption of constitutionality. So, when you are judging the validity of a rule and saying that, look, the rule violates Article 14, the rule may violate Article 14 in a number of ways. It may suffer from the vice of excessive delegation. That is to say that the rule-making power does not have any checks and balances. It is an undefined power given to the government. It may travel beyond the scope of the parent legislation. The rule-making power may have no nexus with the parent legislation. Third, it may be manifestly arbitrary because it may adopt a procedure which is so manifestly arbitrary. It may dispense with, it may give the government the power to pass orders without hearing anybody. So, in such particular circumstances, it may become manifestly arbitrary. So, insofar as subordinate legislation or delegated legislation is concerned, we use the term arbitrariness in the terms of ultra vires. It is ultra vires because ultimately because 14 at the level of before Shaira Banu's judgment, 14 in the level of primary legislation and secondary legislation was operating on a similar scale, barring for the fact that manifest arbitrariness will apply only to subordinate legislation and not to primary legislation. Now what Shaira Banu has done is, it has brought test for subordinate legislation to primary legislation. That is the biggest problem.
It is. So when there is equality before law, why there is a provision? He has written Article 14, Clause 3. I think it should be 15.3. That is for women and scheduled caste.
My learned friend has to read the judgment of in Champakam Dharirajan. See, what happened was, I'll give you when Champakam Dharirajan, why 15.3 came was 15.3 was introduced by the First Amendment to the Constitution. There was a Madras ordinance, a Madras communal geo, which said that backward classes for every, they fixed a particular roster formula saying that for every 24 or 25 backward class candidates, one general category candidate can be admitted to the college, something like that. There's a formula. when the constitution came into force, a lady called Champakan Dorairajan, who was a 37-year-old lady, wanted to get into MBBS, filed a writ petition in the Madras High Court saying there cannot be any discrimination again in matters of in education, and because Article 14 forbids such classification on the basis of a particular because she was a Brahmin lady. So she filed a writ petition. Madras High Court quashed the GO. Then Jawaharlal Nehru panicked because the entire Madras ministry went by way of aeroplane and sat in Delhi saying that, look, come on, amend the constitution, introduce 15.3. 15.3 was introduced by way as a measure of affirmative action, saying that it carves out an exception from the equality principle. The reason why this is done is, friends, very simple. There is something known as equality in fact and equality in law. Persons who need not be similarly situated in fact. There may be persons who have been economically and socially disadvantaged. They need special care and special protection and special benefits from the state. So affirmative action programs are targeted at these persons so that they also become equal in fact. And they are also enabled to come up in the society and be like others. So affirmative action programs are an exception to the general principle of equality. It is known as what is known as the principle of substantive equality. Article 14, we are saying equality before the law is a formal principle. Substantive principle of equality says affirmative action programs can be pursued so that persons who suffer from factual inequality may be brought up and made in line with other members of society. So to that extent, the state can discriminate and confer benefits on those categories so that they are brought in line and they are also become useful members of society.
Basically, to ameliorate the society and the downtrodden.
Exactly.
This is the last question we will be taking. So could you explain the concept of reasonableness in Article 19 in a simple language, which an ordinary person could understand?
That's a difficulty. You see, Article 19 is a very dangerous thing. Now, look, what is unreasonable? There is no definition of what is unreasonable. I hope I could give you a one-stop definition of saying what is unreasonable. But the fact remains that different rights in Article 19 will have different standards of reasonableness. A right under 19(1)(g) need not necessarily have the same degree of protection as a right under 19(1)(a), which is right to freedom of speech and expression. All I can tell you and give you a simple answer is that 19(1)(a) occupies the central place. Freedom of speech and expression is a very sacred right. And that right has been held to be very, very sacred by the courts also. If you look at the very first decision in Ramesh Thapar, to Shreya Singhal, the court will protect free speech to the extent of sedition. That is the only, you see the exceptions to 19(2) to free speech. You will find a thing. But the court will impose a very, very high standard for guaranteeing freedom of speech and expression. Other rights will come in the problem is I can't give you a one-line answer to this particular question because what is reasonable will necessarily depend upon the facts of each case and depending upon what right is infringed, whether it is a right of free speech or 19(1)(g) or some other right. So you can't have a straitjacket answer.
I understand you're saying in that one shoe, there cannot be one shoe which fits all.
One shoe, yeah. There cannot be a one size fits all approach.
Yeah. The last question, this is I've just received on the WhatsApp because some people posted it on the WhatsApp, and I found that this is how do you compare the test of Wednesbury unreasonableness to the manifest arbitrariness test? Is the standard of scrutiny, scope of review largely identical, or there are several differences?
That's a very nice, very good question. Wednesbury's unreasonableness is a facet of it's a challenge to administrative action. The difference is, and in my opinion, you cannot apply Wednesbury. No country in the world, even England, where Wednesbury was developed, has applied Wednesbury to a legislation. It is preposterous. it is heresy to say that Wednesbury applies to a legislation. The reason is this: Wednesbury was a case which developed out of as most of you would know, an action by the Wednesbury Corporation in London, saying that you will not have cinema theaters running in the particular town on Sundays. So Wednesbury was a case which developed saying administrative action can be challenged on the ground of perversity or unreasonableness, in the sense of Wednesbury's unreasonableness. Now, what is Wednesbury's unreasonableness? It is an action which no reasonable person can ever take. Now, I'll ask you a simple question. Can you, in our constitutional law, fundamental principles of constitutional law, say that it is Parliament has acted in a manner which is contrary to Wednesbury's unreasonableness, because parliamentarian has passed a law which no reasonable person can pass? It runs against the basic principle of our constitutional law, that a law is presumed to be constitutionally valid. So that is the difficulty in applying Wednesbury's unreasonableness to manifest arbitrariness. But let me tell you very honestly, if you look at the judgment which struck down Section 87 of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act, very recent judgment of Justice Nariman.
Right. Justice Fulton.
Correct. If you, this is a very, very pertinent question. Please look at that decision. It is dangerously close to applying Wednesbury to legislation. Please study the judgment, you will see what I meant.
In fact, Wednesbury doctrine of proportionality, there are some issues which
proportionality, the difficulty, Vikas, is that, look, I mean, one has to take a stand. In the UK itself, proportionality took several generations to develop. In 2001, in Om Kumar's case, Justice Jagannatha Rao said proportionality is a doctrine still evolving in UK, therefore we are going to apply only Wednesbury. Then in Ganayutham's case, also same thing he said. So proportionality and now I think only Justice Chandrachud has been recently applying proportionality of late. But the law proportionality analysis has to develop and get refined to our standards. We are by and large using only Wednesbury.
Because service matters, yes, you will find where we apply a doctrine of proportionality, and we had one of the sessions by Justice.
Because yes, sir, dismissal, whether the punishment is proportionate to the act, correct?
Yes. Only on that. The scales of justice have to be balanced. How do you go about it?
That's it.
Yeah. So the questions are continuing to pour on. So last question we will take: isn't affirmative action continued beyond a particular period itself against the Article 14?
Look, this is a long-standing debate. Please look at the judgment of Justice Chandrachud in K.C. Vasant Kumar's case. K.C. Vasant Kumar was a decision given in 1985. And 1985, the judges said, we hope and trust that reservation will not go beyond 2000, 15 more years. Because as you know, in the Constitution, I think it's Article 334 or 335. It was only first 15 years and Parliament periodically amends it. So it was still 1965, then it is 1980, and it became 15 years it's been amending now. So in 1985, they said in Vasant Kumar, we hope, a trust and hope it doesn't go beyond 2000. But we are in 2020. The difficulty is, it is impossible to tell when exactly all persons have come up to a particular standard. There are still persons who are suffering and who are below poverty in our country. You know our social situation is. So I think it's not a very wise thing to keep unreasonable outer limits. But if we are still at our 100th year and we are still having reservation, then there's something very seriously wrong with our policy. We have to realize that it must work so effectively that all the persons who are to be empowered through reservation must come up at a reasonably fast pace. If you're going to be giving reservation in bits and pieces, then it's going to be counterproductive. But Vasant Kumar has voiced the concern which you are voicing, saying you cannot have indefinite referendums. But unfortunately, that has not been taken into account. That was said 35 years ago. We are now in 2020.
On the parting shot, I'm just reminded what was said, that if to do was as easy as to say, then all poor would have lived in the palaces. With that parting shot, we can thank Sharath, and on behalf of all the participants who are watching us on the Facebook as well as on this platform, we thank Mr. Sharath for giving the insights to a topic which on the first brush it looks to be very simplistic, and like what Sharad said, that there are certain topics for which you can talk hours and hours, and that is why when constitution was talked about, there are debates and debates which we can keep on reading. It's on the first brush it looks very simple, simplistic, but if all the topics were so simple, then the volumes of judgments running in hundreds and thousands of pages wouldn't have come across. Only on manifest arbitrariness or arbitrariness, unreasonable, and that is why they say that constitution is a living institution which continues. So thank you, Sharath, for all the insights, and we will connect with you after this session. We will see on what topic we can connect with you. And thanks to all those participants. Everyone stay safe, stay blessed. And tomorrow we would be having a session with Professor B.T. Kaul, former chairman of the Delhi Judicial Academy. I'm just giving the exact topic. So tomorrow's topic would be group liability under section 34 and 149 of IPC. So do stay connected with us. But tomorrow being a Saturday, we will be having at 6 p.m. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe, stay blessed.
Thank you, Vikas.
Thank you.